I was standing in the middle of my great-grandfather's ranch, watching HOA board members shake champagne over a ribbon-cutting ceremony, for a railway line they built right through my cattle pens. "There's nothing you can do about it," Karen number 1 smirked. "But that's the moment they triggered the trap my family buried 100 years ago. Literally. Yeah. There's a clause in their deed that they didn't read. And now I own the entire HOA. And the railway. And their homes? Let's just say, foreclosure was the kindest option. How did we get here? Buckle up. Because this isn't just petty. This is generational revenge. A month earlier, I was repairing a busted section of fence after a storm when I noticed a strange group of people in business suits wandering the edge of my property. Clipboards, hard hats, the works. At first, I figured they were from the county, inspecting the easement or doing some survey work. Happens now and then. But the longer they lingered, the more suspicious I got. One of them, a tall lady with a phone glued to her palm and a haircut sharp enough to slice cheese, was clearly in charge. She pointed straight at my cattle pens and made a slicing motion with her hand. I knew that motion. That was the international sign for, "We're about to bulldoze this." I walked over to say howdy, and before I could even ask what was going on, she waved a stack of papers in my face and introduced herself as president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. Whispering Pines, for context, is a fancy little gated community that sprouted up a few years back like a patch of fungus right on the edge of my family's land. McMansions, wine moms, overpriced yoga classes, real Stepford vibes. And now, apparently, a railway line. Karen number 1. Yes, I'm calling her that because there were 3 of them, said the HOA had secured a development permit to build a private shuttle line to the new tech hub 20 miles out. "It'll increase property values across the board," she said, beaming like she'd invented concrete. "Unfortunately, the access route goes through this." She gestured vaguely at the field behind her, where my Angus bulls were peacefully munching hay, completely unaware that corporate suburbia was trying to evict them. I blinked. "You mean my ranch?" She smiled tighter. "Temporary construction easement. Perfectly legal. You'll be compensated." "Compensated," she said, like I was supposed to hand over generational land for a few gift cards and a commemorative mug. I asked if she'd consulted the deed records or the county plat map. She said the HOA's lawyers had handled all that. She even patted my shoulder like I was a confused child and added, "It's best if you don't get too involved. These projects can be complicated." Oh, sweetheart. Complicated is what I do. 2 weeks later, I woke up to the sound of bulldozers growling like they owned the place. They'd mowed down a 1/4 acre of prairie grass, plowed straight through my cattle fence, and poured fresh gravel across a line that ran exactly 12 feet into my grazing field. Karen number 2 and number 3 were there, clapping politely as crews hammered in stake. I watched in silence from the porch, coffee in hand, not saying a word. Because in that moment I remembered something my grandfather once told me while whittling wood in this very spot. "One day, someone's gonna come knockin'. They'll want what we got. But don't worry, we already buried the answer." Back then, I'd thought he was being poetic. Turns out, he meant it literally. That night, I went up into the attic, pushed past boxes of rusted horseshoes, and found the old chest with the leather bindings. Inside, beneath family ledgers and brittle photographs, was a file labeled McAllister Land Trust, a 1923 revision. I opened it, and right there in black and white typewriter ink was the clause. If any industrial construction, defined as rail, utility, or commercial access, occurred on Parcel 4B without direct authorization from the McAllister Trust, ownership of all adjoining properties utilizing said access would revert to the trust after 30 calendar days of unchallenged encroachment. I read that line 4 times. Then I laughed. Because Parcel 4B was exactly where they'd laid that railway. And no one had asked me for authorization. And guess what? Their property lines fed into it. They'd legally triggered their own forfeiture. The next morning, I went down to the county records office. The clerk, a sweet lady named Janice who'd known my family for decades, helped me pull up the HOA's charter and deed references. It took about an hour before she whistled and said, "Oh my. They didn't file the variance properly. You could roast them with this." I told her I intended to do just that. Quietly. Meanwhile, back on the ranch, the railway work doubled down. Karen number 1 brought over an HOA compliance officer to inspect my barn. They fined me for unsightly fencing and non-conforming livestock odor. That's right, they tried to fine a fifth-generation cattle ranch for smelling like cows. They were trying to bury me in paper cut. What they didn't realize was that I was building a paper guillotine. I started recording everything. Every fence post they dug up. Every livestock path they blocked. Every conversation where they bragged about forcing the old farmer to move. And I kept smiling. Let them think I was defeated. That was the plan. What made it even better was how smug they were. Karen number 1 actually told a news crew that they were modernizing a backwards area. Said my land was underutilized and neglected. That clip was going to age like milk in the Sahara. 3 days before the 30-day deadline, I sent them a certified letter from the McAllister Trust legal office. Not a bluff. I had a lawyer by now, Rosie Martinez, an old college friend who now specialized in rural land rights and corporate overreach. She read the clause and said, and I quote, "Oh my God. This is the rancher's version of the new codes." The letter politely informed the HOA that due to their encroachment, their access infrastructure, including the railway, had violated trust terms, triggering reversion of rights. Failure to vacate or rectify within the next 72 hours would result in legal transfer of title under Article 5. We even included the original clause, notarized lineage records, and historical land map. Neatly color-coded. The next morning, I saw Karen number 1 outside my fence line, on the phone, yelling so loud even the bulls perked up. She pointed wildly at the railroad like it had betrayed her. She hadn't known. None of them had. Because they never bothered to ask what they were standing on. They thought they could just roll in, build what they wanted, and slap me with a fine if I got in the way. The train didn't even have time to finish its test run. But that wasn't even the best part. That came later, when I walked into the next HOA board meeting. Yes, I was invited, and dropped a bomb so big it made the reversion clause look like a firecracker. Because while they were busy drinking champagne and planning commuter routes, I'd been doing more than just reading paperwork. And what I found next, oh boy, it changed everything. Karen's face was the color of curdled milk when I walked into that HOA meeting. I wasn't supposed to be there, according to her. The look she gave me when I took a seat in the back corner, cowboy boots propped up on the edge of a cheap faux wood table, was one of barely concealed panic. Her voice cracked as she called the meeting to order, trying to pretend everything was business as usual, while her brain was no doubt doing cartwheels trying to figure out how the hell this rancher had outmaneuvered her. I didn't say a word at first. I just sat there with a thermos of sweet tea and a folder in my lap, listening as they argued about community garden plans and whether vinyl fences violated neighborhood harmony standard. The usual HOA nonsense. The last item on the agenda was external legal challenge involving railway infrastructure. That was my cue. Karen didn't want to acknowledge me, but the HOA's treasurer, a quiet man named Ron with the permanent look of someone trapped in a family he didn't choose, asked if they should hear from the opposing party. Karen tried to brush it off, said it was a minor property misunderstanding, nothing worth escalating. That's when I leaned forward and said, real calm, the misunderstanding is whether you'd prefer to forfeit the railway line or the whole community. Dead silence. A man in the back dropped his water bottle. Karen laughed nervously and told everyone not to listen to me, that I was exaggerating, that none of this was enforceable. So I handed the folder to Ron. Inside were copies of the land reversion clause, the documentation of the McAllister Trust, and most importantly, 2 court-stamped notices confirming that our legal team had filed for enforcement. Rosie had made sure every T was crossed and every I dotted. Ron flipped through the papers, eyebrows climbing higher and higher. Someone asked what it meant. I answered for him. It meant that because they'd used our land to build access for their HOA infrastructure without authorization, and because 30 days had passed without correction, we were entitled to reclaim land connected to the violation. In layman's terms, they'd built their dream community on a legal landmine, and it had just gone off. Karen tried to interrupt, to say it was ridiculous, but Ron cut her off and asked the only question that mattered. Can we fight this? I shrugged. Sure, if you've got a couple million lying around in 10 years to kill in court. Or, you could negotiate. That was the moment they realized I wasn't bluffing. And I wasn't done. Outside the meeting, I told Rosie to start filing paperwork for adjacent land purchases. The moment news got out, homeowners were going to panic and sell, and I intended to buy every square inch I could get my hands on. While they were still huddled in a panic spiral, we made calls to every former landowner who'd been squeezed out by the HOA years ago, families fined until they gave up, old folks bullied into selling their homes. The trust bought their properties back, often at half the price the HOA had originally paid, and we started piecing together a slow legal net around the community. But Karen, predictably, didn't go down without a tantrum. 3 days later, she showed up at my ranch gate with a clipboard, a citation, and a smug little sheriff's deputy in tow. Said I was in violation of dust runoff regulations for my tractor kicking up dirt too close to their newly built walking trail. That trail, of course, ran through land I now legally own. I invited them in to inspect, and when they crossed the fence line, I handed the deputy a notice of trespass. Poor guy turned beet red and mumbled something about just doing his job. Karen, however, lost it completely. She screamed that I was abusing the law, that I was ruining the community, that I was a backwards hick with a grudge. That's when I calmly pulled out my phone and played the recording I'd taken at the ribbon-cutting ceremony. Her voice, clear as day, saying, "There's nothing you can do about it." Followed by laughter. I ended the video and said, "Turns out there was something." She stormed off, practically dragging the deputy behind her. I didn't see her again for another week, and when I did, it was even better than I imagined. By now, the HOA board was imploding. Ron had resigned. 2 other board members were trying to distance themselves, claiming Karen had made decisions without full board approval. Homeowners were panicking. Property values were dropping, the shuttle project was dead in the water, and rumors were flying that the McAllister Trust was going to reclaim the entire subdivision. I stayed quiet. Let them stew. The more they tried to scramble, the deeper they sank. Because while they were busy arguing about bylaws and board elections, I was busy pulling another thread. You see, when they laid that railway, they didn't just violate the trust land. They accidentally crossed a protected wildlife corridor, something my grandfather had written into a conservation contract back in the 70s. It was rarely enforced because nobody ever built anything out there. But now? Now they'd laid steel through a habitat known for hosting nesting red-tailed hawks, which, in case you didn't know, are a protected species under state law. One anonymous tip later, and the environmental agency was on site with clipboards of their own, taking measurements and snapping photos. Karen had no idea how to deal with them. No amount of fining a rancher for excessive hay stacking was going to undo what they'd just triggered. You could see the stress melting her Botox. Meanwhile, Rosie found something even better. While digging through old filings, she discovered that the HOA had been using a special beautification tax fund to pay for private board retreats and, in one particularly stupid case, a wine tasting tour in Napa Valley listed as community enrichment. Illegal misuse of funds. We filed a whistleblower report. The IRS started poking around. Karen, finally understanding the walls were closing in, called a private meeting. This time, she didn't invite me, but Ron did. He'd had enough of her nonsense. I walked in to find Karen sweating through her blouse, pacing like a trapped cat. She offered a deal. Drop the land claim, keep the railway, and the HOA would pay for damages to the ranch. She even offered to name the shuttle station after my grandfather. I said no. Politely. Firmly. And then I told her the real kicker. Remember that clubhouse they built? The one with the big glass atrium and the community pool? It sat directly on the reversion-affected zone. That meant I could legally take ownership. Not just the land. The building. Every pool floaty and ping-pong table inside. Her voice cracked as she asked, "You wouldn't really do that, would you?" I smiled. "You started this. I'm just finishing it." But even I didn't expect what happened next. As we were leaving the meeting, Rosie got a call from the court clerk. An expedited hearing had been approved. The judge wanted to see us the next morning to rule on our petition to dissolve the HOA charter under breach of contract and violation of original land terms. It was happening faster than we thought. And Karen? Karen didn't even know the worst part yet. Because the moment that charter got dissolved, something else kicked in. A second clause in the McAllister Trust. One that didn't just give us land rights. It gave us ownership of the access road into Whispering Pines. That's right. I was about to own the only road in or out of the entire gated community. And when they found out, things were going to get a whole lot messier. By the time we walked into the courthouse the next morning, Karen looked like she hadn't slept in days. Her foundation was creasing at the edges. Her hair was frazzled in a way she normally would have screamed at someone for, and she didn't have that usual arrogant lift to her chin. She looked beat and for once quiet. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. The hearing wasn't long. The judge, a stern but fair man who'd lived in the county his entire life, had already reviewed the documentation. He barely glanced up from the files before saying, "It seems the HOA knowingly violated trust-protected property, misused community funds, and failed to disclose encroachment liability to homeowners. That's 3 breaches of charter and a clear violation of state land law." He turned to Karen and asked if she had anything to say. She tried. She really did. Something about how she was misled, how she didn't realize the extent of the clause, how this would unfairly affect innocent homeowners. The judge raised one eyebrow and said, "You built a private railway through someone else's property and called it beautification." That shut her up real quick. With a bang of the gavel, the HOA's charter was officially dissolved. They no longer had governing power. No more fines. No more enforcement. No more fake security patrols in their little golf carts. The HOA board members were now just regular homeowners with zero authority, and the community they'd built their petty empire on was suddenly leaderless. But the real storm didn't hit until a week later, when I exercised the clause about the access road. The very next morning, I had a crew install a brand new gate at the entrance of the road leading into Whispering Pines. A big, heavy-duty cattle-style gate, with a keypad, and a sign that read Private Road. McAllister Trust Property. Entry by permit only. That's when the phone call started. First it was Karen. She tried to sound civil, even friendly. She asked if we could work something out so residents wouldn't be inconvenienced. I told her that we'd be happy to offer paid access permits, provided they filled out the appropriate request forms and signed a waiver acknowledging they were crossing trust property. She asked how much. I said $500 per household, annually. She choked. Said it was extortion. I said it was less than what they charged me for improper hay storage last year, and I didn't even get a gate code out of it. She hung up. Then came the homeowners themselves. Some angry. Some confused. A few even apologetic. One guy offered to bring over a pie and mow my field if I'd waive his permit. I said no to the pie, yes to the mowing. Hey, petty doesn't mean heartless. The best part? With the HOA dissolved, there was no centralized process to appeal or unify. Every single homeowner had to deal with me individually. No board. No group vote. Just me, a stack of forms, and a very slow printer. Karen couldn't take it. Within a few days, she'd organized a neighborhood action council, and sent a legal letter claiming that blocking the road violated emergency access requirements. Rosie responded with a detailed breakdown showing how, legally, we'd provided a new fire access lane just 100 yards east. It wasn't paved. It wasn't pretty. But it was legal. Karen tried to argue it wasn't usable during heavy rain. I sent her a weather forecast and a pair of boots. Then came the real bombshell. While they were busy fighting with me about road access and scrambling to form a new HOA, Rosie dug deeper into the HOA's past land acquisitions and found something breathtaking. Turns out, the HOA had acquired several parcels around the clubhouse under questionable terms, many of which were still legally disputed. But more importantly, one of those parcels had a clause tied to the McAllister Trust's historical zoning protections. Specifically, if the land was used for commercial purposes, including rentals, events, or retail sales, without trust consent, ownership could be challenged. And wouldn't you know it? The clubhouse had hosted several paid events over the years. Weddings, wine tastings, even a hot yoga pop-up. All of it commercial. All of it illegal. So we filed a new petition to seize the clubhouse. Karen completely lost her mind. She came storming onto my ranch, screaming something about generational theft and calling me a monster with a vendetta. I didn't say a word. Just handed her a copy of the complaint and reminded her of the golden rule. You mess with the bull, you get the paperwork. The complaint passed review faster than I expected. I was awarded temporary custodianship of the building pending final transfer. Karen stood outside the clubhouse on transfer day, arms crossed, blocking the door like she could stop what was coming. She shouted at the county officials, claimed she was being harassed. One of the deputies calmly pointed out she was trespassing. That was the moment her legs buckled just a little. After the keys were handed to me, I held an open house. Invited every former resident who'd been fined, harassed, or shamed by the HOA over the years. Old folks who'd been written up for leaving garden gnomes out too long. Families fined for Christmas lights. One guy who'd been penalized for using the wrong shade of beige on his garage door. I gave them a tour of the newly dubbed McAllister Community Barn. Free coffee, live music, and a lovely new plaque over the entry that read Karen's Folly. The original nameplate? Mounted above the bathroom urinal. But I wasn't done. Because while the clubhouse victory was poetic, it wasn't the end. Remember that railway? Still sitting there like an abandoned corpse across my land. I had a few options. I could have torn it up. Let it rust. But that would have been too simple. Instead, I reached out to a local agricultural co-op. They'd been trying for years to get freight access for their produce. With my permission, they applied for a grant to convert the tracks into a produce rail, an old-school farm-to-market system. The co-op jumped on the idea. The grant was approved. And the best part? The rail line would run directly through the old HOA land, now partially controlled by the trust. Karen heard about the deal the same day her car was booted for unpaid road access fees. She showed up on my porch again, this time quieter, smaller. She asked what it would take to make it all go away. She even offered to leave the neighborhood, sell her house, and vanish. I asked her one question. Did you ever apologize to the families you hurt? The ones you fined into foreclosure? The ones who left their homes because you made them feel small? She didn't answer. Just stared at the dirt. I handed her a folder labeled Restorative Options, with forms offering options for HOA victims to reclaim their properties or receive restitution through the new trust-backed fund we'd set up. I told her if she wanted peace, she'd have to help make it happen. The next day, she was gone. House emptied. For sale sign out front. No goodbye note. Just a single envelope left in the HOA drop box, addressed to me. Inside was a picture of her at the ribbon cutting, champagne in hand, grinning. On the back, a single line in shaky handwriting, I never thought you'd win. But I wasn't finished winning yet. Because right as I leaned back in my chair that evening, sipping sweet tea and watching the sun set over the ranch, Rosie called. She'd uncovered one last piece of the puzzle. One that changed everything. one that could shift the entire land ownership structure of the subdivision. And it had Karen's name all over it. Rosie's voice on the phone was calm, but I could tell something was different. The way she said my name, like she wasn't sure if I was ready for what she was about to say. She told me to sit down. I already was, but I stood up just to sit again. Then she said it. Karen hadn't just been running the HOA into the ground with petty fines and personal grudges. She'd been hiding something. Something big. A side fund. Unregistered, unreported, and full of questionable payments. The money wasn't coming from member dues. It was coming from kickbacks, specifically from contractors who'd been awarded sweetheart deals for construction projects on the HOA's land, including the railway. Karen had been getting paid off, funneled through a shell company registered in her cousin's name. Rosie had found it while digging through the property transfers and vendor record. It was sloppy, almost laughably so, but it was real. And it was criminal. We didn't go public with it right away. First, we verified every detail, traced every transfer, and got copies of the checks, contracts, and emails. Then Rosie sent the whole package to the state attorney general's office. They didn't even wait a week before launching an investigation. Subpoenas were issued. Bank accounts were frozen. Karen, who had quietly vanished after leaving that envelope, was suddenly the subject of a full-blown corruption probe. News trucks started showing up near Whispering Pines. Reporters knocked on doors. Cameras zoomed in on that cursed railway like it was a murder scene. The homeowners, already reeling from the collapse of the HOA and the mess with the road permits, now found themselves in the middle of a financial scandal. They were furious. Some had already sold and left. Others couldn't. Their property values were in freefall. The nice, sterile, rule-filled suburb they'd bought into had turned into a cautionary tale on every local news channel. And through it all, the McAllister Trust held steady. We weren't gloating, not publicly. But we were busy. We had launched a land buyback program for those who wanted out. Rosie and I personally met with each family, reviewed their situations, and offered them fair market value, often more than what they paid. Not everyone took the offer. Some held out, hoping for a rebound. But the ones who did, they left with clean hands and a fresh start. The trust expanded. What was once my grandfather's ranch was now a growing patchwork of reclaimed land, conservation zones, and community gardens run by the very people the HOA had once driven out. The clubhouse was repurposed into a shared town hall. Local kids held art shows there. A retired carpenter built a stage for performances. We held our first Harvest Fest that fall. Live music, cider, bonfires. Someone even carved a pumpkin that looked suspiciously like Karen's face. I didn't ask who. But I laughed harder than I probably should have. As the community rebuilt itself around cooperation instead of control, I took some time to breathe. Rode the perimeter of the ranch on horseback again, like I used to. The cattle were calm. The air was clear. And for the first time in years, the land felt settled. My grandfather's words echoed in my head every time I crossed the old fence line. Never sell. Never bow. Always fight smart. I hadn't just protected our land. I'd protected its legacy. The story wasn't just about me anymore. It was about everyone who'd been bulldozed, fined, silenced. They had a place again. A voice. A stake in something real. But poetic justice still had one last act. A few months later, I received a call from the auction house handling seized assets from Karen's shell company. They were liquidating everything tied to the investigation, including real estate. And wouldn't you know it, Karen's house had been purchased through that very company. Meaning it was up for grabs. I bought it, quietly. No big announcement. Just signed the papers, took the keys, and had the locks changed. The house wasn't anything special. Gaudy decor, too much chrome in the kitchen, those weird little chandeliers she probably thought looked European. But it sat on a nice patch of land. And the backyard? Perfect for horses. We turned it into a stable. Fenced it off, leveled the lawn, and added a feed shed. The neighbors were confused at first. Some were amused. others annoyed. But I kept it clean, well-maintained, and surprisingly peaceful. One day, I overheard a couple walking their dog, referring to it as the Redemption Ranch. I didn't correct them. Sounded about right. I named one of the manure carts Karen Express. Just for fun. Later that winter, I visited my grandfather's grave again. Brought him a bottle of his favorite bourbon and sat for a while, watching the wind ripple through the grass. I told him everything. The railway. The claws. The courtroom. The clubhouse. I could almost hear him laughing. That deep, dry chuckle he always did when someone underestimated him. I thanked him for the trap. For trusting me to spring it. The story got picked up by national outlets eventually. They called it The Ranch That Beat the HOA. Rosie did an interview. I didn't. I didn't need the spotlight. The people who needed to know already knew. The folks who used to nod politely when I passed now waved. Some stopped to chat. Others asked for gardening tip. One kid brought me a drawing of my horse, titled Mr. Jake and the Freedom Ranch. I hung it in the community barn. It wasn't about revenge anymore. Not really. That part had already played out, like the final notes of a well-timed song. What lingered was something deeper. Something earned. The land felt like it could breathe again. No more fences drawn by people who never walked the soil. No more rules written in air-conditioned offices by folks who thought grass was just a background filter for real estate listings. Karen? Last I heard, she was living in a condo across the state line. Small place. No HOA. The irony was too good to ignore. Sometimes I wondered if she ever drove past the ranch. If she saw the stables where her backyard used to be. If she recognized the gate. If she knew the community she tried to conquer was thriving without her. Probably not. People like her rarely look back. They just vanish into their own bitterness, convinced they were the victims all along. But out here, where the fences are low and the history runs deep, we remember. We remember every fine, every insult, every time someone tried to tell us we didn't belong on land our families bled for. And now? We own the story, the land, the legacy, and the tracks they laid to cut us in half? We turn them into a bridge.